Hey peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is part 2 of the Butterick 6130 sew along, and today we're going to be making the bodice. So let's get started. Before we get started, you want to make sure that you've transferred all of your markings over to your fabric. So we've got these ones around here which are going to relate to the collar. We've got these ones down here which relate to the gathering, and I've already done this, but the way I like to do it is when everything is still pinned in place, I will put a pin through the pattern and all layers of the fabric, and then I will slowly peel them back and mark it with my friction pen, and my friction pen comes away with heat. I've tested it on these fabrics to make sure that it doesn't stain or mark the fabrics permanently, and it's all good on this one. Some cottons that I've used them on, it does leave a white residue, so you do want to make sure that the fabric that you're using doesn't end up with a stain on it. Step 1 is to gather lower edge of bodice front and bodice back between the circles. So that's those marks that we've just seen. So you want to run 2 lines of gathering stitches, and I like to do mine one at 3/8 of an inch away from the cut edge, and then another one 3/4 of an inch away from the cut edge, which means that my stitching line will be right between the two. So I'm going to do that on the bodice front and bodice backs for both the lining and the fashion fabric. Once you've got all your gathering stitches in place, we're going to stitch the bodice back to bodice front at shoulders and sides. And again, do the same for the lining and the fashion fabric. Step 4 does say prepare bodice and midriff lining in the same manner as described in the bodice and midriff, but I just like to do them all at the same time. So I'm going to stitch everything together at 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to pink the seams and then press everything open. I've pinked all the edges of the seams. This will just, I mean, this bodice is going to be fully lined, but this will just help with the longevity of these seams and stop this fraying. Because I'm using a very different and lighter fabric for the bodice than I am for the trousers, I'm actually now going to skip ahead to the sleeve for A, because I have that thread in my machine. So the first step is to stitch a seam of sleeve. So I'm going to do that for both the outer and the lining. And I have sewn all of the sleeves together. One trick when you're working with a fabric that doesn't have a right or wrong side, put a pin in the wrong side on both pieces, and that way you will make sure that you end up with the opposite pieces, not two of the same. Anyone who's watched the linen jacket challenge on the Great British Sewing Bee will know what I'm talking about. I'm now going to go and press all of these seams open so that I can sew the sleeves together. Next step is to pin lining to sleeve, right sides together, matching seams, stitch lower edge, trim seam allowance, and then you're going to understitch the lining to the seam allowance. So I'm going to get that done. The thing you want to watch out for here is to make sure that you've got the right sides together. So you've got the 2 backs together and the 2 fronts together, if you see what I mean. I've got the right side of the fashion fabric facing in, I've got the right side of the lining fabric facing out, and I have my single notch and my double notches matched up the same. So I'm going to insert this in here and match up the raw edges, and that's what I'm going to stitch together. Got the right sides pinned together, so I'm going to stitch along this raw edge at 5/8 of an inch to secure the seams together and finish the lower edge. And I'm going to do that with the lining side up underneath the presser foot like that. I've trimmed off the excess seam allowance, and now I'm going to press the seam allowance into the lining side so that I can understitch there to make sure, well, so that I can understitch here to make sure that the lining does stay inside the sleeve. So I'm going to go press all of the seam allowance into the lining side of the sleeve. I'm understitching the seam allowance in place, and as you can see I have pressed all of the seam allowance towards the lining, and I have got the centre of my foot running along the stitching line, and then I've moved my needle over a little bit so that I am stitching close to but not on that stitching line, and this is just going to help the lining to stay inside of the sleeve when it's finished. So I'm going to go around and do that for both sleeves. When you've finished pressing it all, and I suggest that you press with the inside lining showing so that you can make sure that the exterior is just rolled over just a little bit so that it is all concealed when you have a finished sleeve. It says to pin lining to bodice, wrong sides together, matching notches, centres, circles and seams. Baste armhole edges together, baste neck edges together between the squares. So we've got the squares there, so we're going to baste all the way around the top and then baste the edges of this together. And we're also going to baste together the edges of the sleeves, which will make attaching them so much easier when we get to that stage. And again, I'm skipping the midriff section here because my midriff is going to be in my dark green crepe back satin, so I need to change threads on my machine, and I want to do as much of the bodice as possible in cream thread before I do that. Right, I have got the armholes basted together and I've got the neckline basted together to the large squares at the back. So the next thing it wants me to do is gather the neck edge of bodice between each set of circles, which we have marked earlier, so there and there on both sides. But whilst that area is still relatively flat, I'd like to get the sleeves in because I want to French seam them. It doesn't mention it in the instructions, but you're going to need to sew 2 lines of gathering stitches so that you can ease the sleeve cap into the armhole. First step is to sew the sleeve in wrong sides together at 1/4 inch. Okay, so I've sewn my sleeves wrong sides together at 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm now going to trim that seam allowance down to 1/8 inch, and I want to be careful to not trim the gathering threads that I have used here. Once I've trimmed it down, I'm going to turn it so that the right side's together and then press it so I have a clean edge, pin it and sew it at 3/8 inch, and then I'll have a nice French seam which will enclose all of the raw edges. I've got the bodice part of my jumpsuit done. Lots of gathering in here rather than darts, which is nice, and it's nice with this big print as well. I was working with scraps, so I'm quite pleased that I've managed to get even one hummingbird on the bodice, and I happen to have a hummingbird on the sleeve, which was a happy accident. I think, yeah, there's one back there as well. It's looking good. I'm slightly worried it's not going to be quite long enough for my torso, but I have lengthened the pattern on the waistband, which is what I needed to do, so we shall see. Okay, everything I needed the cream thread for is done, so I'm going to work on the midriff sections to then attach to the bodice. We're back to step 3, which is stitch midriff front to midriff back at side seams. So we're going to do that for the outer and the inner. Now I have a crepe back satin or a satin back crepe, so I'm going to use the crepe as the right side for the outer, but I'm going to use the satin side for the right side for the lining because the trousers are going to be this, so I just think it's going to feel nice. So if you have a particular type of fabric that you need to pay attention to sides of it, like I said before, put a pin in either the right or wrong side of both pieces just so that you don't get them confused. Right, so I've pinned the midriff outer to the outer fashion fabric, and I've pinned at the side seams, the back, the centre, and then at the red dots, or at the dots which indicate the gathering portions. So I've pinned there, and then I've gathered the fabric down so it lies within the designated area, and then I've sewn at 5/8 inch, and I need to press this seam down towards the midriff panel. So I'll show you it pinned on the lining piece, but I wanted to get one done and see how it went together to make sure that I had it all going correctly. So I'm going to get this one pinned so that I can show you what I mean. Okay, so I have the lining midriff pinned to the lining bodice, and I have matched up the notches, the centre front, the sides and the very back edge, and then I've pinned in and up to the gathering points. And then with the gathering points, what you want to do is pull on the 2 threads to get the fabric gathered down so it sits flush against the midriff section. Now you want to distribute the gathers along. Right, so that's now sitting flush, but obviously the gathers are not evenly distributed, so you're going to want to do that. Kind of space them out nicely. I'm going to need some more to this end. You can wrap your threads around one of your anchoring pins, which will give you a nice, it'll stop the gathers kind of dissipating off of the end so that you can space them out evenly right up to that edge. Yeah, really it's just a little bit of kind of fussing with everything to get it all lying nicely, and you're going to pin it in place as you go. You don't want anything too dense, and you want to try and distribute them evenly, as I've said, between the points. You're going to do that for all 4 points. So there's the 2 gathering sections on the back, and then there's a section of gathering to either side of the centre front. So you're going to do exactly the same thing, gather it all down, pin it, and then we're going to sew along that edge at 5/8 of an inch. Once everything's pinned, you're going to sew from the beginning at 5/8 of an inch the whole way across. That should take you in between the 2 lines of gathering stitches that you've done, which should give you nicely formed gathers once you remove the basting stitches. You want to sew with the gathered sections up so that you can control the way that the gathers are forming. If anything looks too densely packed, or if it gets a little bit loose, then you can control how that goes under the presser foot. I'm going to sew 5/8 of an inch the whole way across. Once you've got it all sewn in, you're going to want to remove the gathering stitches, which should be fairly easy to do. Okay. So once you've taken all of those out, I'm then going to pink this edge, and we want to press this seam into the midriff section. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comment section down below, and I will do my best to answer them for you. I really hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!